Talk about the day video games went to war with the United States Senate. It was December 9th, 1993, and in a sterile hearing room in Washington, D.C., something unprecedented was happening. Senators were watching video game footage on official government monitors, their faces twisted in disgust and horror. The room was filled with representatives from Nintendo and Sega, child advocates, including the beloved Captain Kangaroo himself, and a Connecticut senator named Joe Lieberman, who had just declared war on an entire industry. What they were watching would change video games forever. 3 games in particular would spark a congressional firestorm that led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, a system that still governs what you can and cannot play today. This is the story of how Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and Doom didn't just push boundaries. They shattered them so completely that politicians felt compelled to step in and rebuild the entire landscape of interactive entertainment. But this tale begins not with the senators or industry executives, but with a single father buying a Christmas present for his son, completely unaware that he was about to trigger one of the biggest controversies in gaming history. Before we dive into this political thriller, let's explore some fascinating details about the games that caused such an uproar. Mortal Kombat, released in arcades in 1992, was revolutionary, not just for its violence, but for its technology. The characters are created using a technique called digitized photography, where real actors were filmed performing moves and then converted into game sprites. This gave the violence an unprecedented sense of realism that made previous arcade fighters look like cartoons. Night Trap, meanwhile, was an early experiment in interactive cinema, using full-motion video technology that was cutting edge for 1992. The game required the expensive Sega CD add-on, which cost around $300, equivalent to nearly $700 today. Despite its controversial reputation, Night Trap actually featured very little graphic violence. The drill, quote-unquote, that senators were so horrified by was more implied than shown, and the game's tone was closer to a cheesy B-movie than the sadistic torture simulator politicians claimed it to be. Night Trap, meanwhile, was an early experiment in interactive cinema, using full-motion video technology, which was cutting edge for 1992. The game required the expensive Sega CD add-on, which cost around $300, the equivalent of nearly $700 today. The interactive movie game for the Sega CD became one of the most misrepresented pieces of entertainment in the controversy. The interactive movie game for the Sega CD became one of the most misrepresented pieces of entertainment in the controversy. The game cast players as a security officer, monitoring a slumber party through surveillance cameras, trying to protect 5 teenage girls from mysterious hooded attackers called augurs. The gameplay was essentially a point-and-click adventure where players had to activate traps at the right moments to capture the intruders before they could harm the girls. The drill that horrified senators was actually a bizarre contraption used by the augurs to drain their victims' blood. But the device was more silly than scary, looking like something from a cheesy B-horror movie. The irony was that Night Trap was fundamentally about protecting women from harm, not victimizing them. Players who failed to activate the traps correctly would see the girls get captured, but successful players saved them. The game was campy and theatrical, featuring former soap opera actress Dana Plato, and dialogue that was intentionally reminiscent of 1950s horror films. The British Board of Film Classification simply described it as more like an old episode of Doctor Who, and gave it a standard 15 rating. The controversy was largely based on misunderstanding what the game actually contained versus what critics claimed it depicted. Doom, which emerged in December 1993 just as the controversy was reaching its peak, was distributed primarily through a revolutionary new method, the internet. id Software released the first episode as shareware, allowing players to copy and distribute it freely. The timing was crucial. These games arrived during what experts now call the 3D revolution in video games. Previous games had been limited by technology to relatively abstract representations of violence. Space Invaders featured tiny pixelated ships, while even violent games, like Double Dragon, showed cartoonish martial arts battles. Suddenly, technology allowed games to depict realistic-looking humans engaging in graphic violence, complete with blood, screams, and anatomically correct fatalities. Perhaps most importantly, these games were no longer relegated to arcades, where young children needed quarters and adult supervision. Home console versions meant that graphic content could be experienced in the privacy of living rooms, purchased by unsuspecting parents who had no idea what they were bringing into their homes. The chain of events that would reshape an entire industry began with Bill Andreessen, Chief of Staff to Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman. In the fall of 1993, Andreessen's son asked him for what seemed like a simple Christmas gift, the home version of Mortal Kombat for the Sega Genesis. Andreessen dutifully went to the store and purchased the game, thinking he was buying the same kind of harmless entertainment he remembered from his own childhood. When Andreessen brought the game home and watched his son play it, he was horrified. This wasn't Pac-Man or Space Invaders, and they were engaging in brutally graphic combat. When his son performed a fatality, ripping out an opponent's still beating heart or tearing off their head along with the spinal column, Andreessen realized he'd just purchased something that would never have been allowed on television or in movie theaters without strict age restrictions. What made the situation even more disturbing to Andreessen was the marketing. Mortal Kombat wasn't being sold as an adult product hidden away in some back corner of the store. It was prominently displayed alongside children's games, advertised during Saturday morning cartoons, and marketed directly to kids. The game's blood code was practically an open secret, discussed in gaming magazines and playground conversations as if it were just another cheat code for extra lives. Andreessen immediately brought his concerns to Senator Lieberman, a family man who'd built his political career on protecting children and promoting family values. Lieberman was especially shocked by what he saw. Here was a product being sold to children that depicted graphic violence in unprecedented detail, and there seemed to be no oversight or regulation whatsoever. Lieberman began investigating further and discovered Night Trap, which appeared even more problematic to his eyes. While Mortal Kombat at least framed its violence as a martial arts competition, Night Trap seemed to glorify violence against women specifically. The game's premise? Protecting scantily clad sorority sisters from hooded attackers who wanted to drain their blood, struck Lieberman as particularly insidious. In reality, though, it was just a fun game that played like a movie, and the plotline, conveniently ignored in these hearings, all but nullified the complaints. The goal was to protect people, not to hurt them. There was nothing in the show that was so graphic that it wouldn't have appeared on broadcast TV. Here are some scenes from the opening.
Clear. I'm Sims, SCAT Team Commander, SCAT Mission 230. 5 teenage girls on their way to a weekend house party at the old Lakeshore Winery house of Mr. and Mrs. Victor Martin and their 2 children, Jeff and Sarah. Your mission, protect those 5 girls from whatever happened to another bunch of teenagers. They disappeared after spending the night at the Martins. Last night, one of our agents got into the house and found a weird security system. Hidden cameras in almost every room and a series of traps. Our agent spliced an override into the security system, enabling you to control the cameras and the traps with this remote unit. The traps are protected with an access code. They won't work unless you enter the right code. Right now, that code is set at blue, and you have control of the traps. But anyone inside that house can change that code at any time. So listen in. Our override cable is here, in the back hallway. If anyone disconnects it, you lose control, for good. This is my attack squad. And that's Kelly, one of my best undercover agents. She'll be arriving with the rest of the girls. I'm putting her life and the lives of those other girls in your hands. Don't even think of messing up. If you don't have the brains or the guts for this assignment, give the controls to someone who does. The girls should be pulling into the driveway. You're wasting time. Get over there now. Looks like you're not up for this mission. Breaking contact.
And here are some failure scenes. When you don't save the girls, the characters chew out the player.
You're wasting time. Get over there now. Looks like you're not up for this mission. Breaking contact. Look, it was your job to protect Kelly and the rest of those girls. But from what I've just seen, the place is being overrun. You've missed way too many of those suckers. Now, until you figure out how to do your job and do it right, you're dismissed. Breaking contact. I don't believe what I just saw. Those bloodsuckers just got Lisa, and you had a chance to save her. I put the lives of those girls in your hands, and you screwed up. I'm pulling the plug on you before you do any more damage. Breaking contact. You're missing the point here. You've got to be trapping more of those leeches. This just won't cut it. You put those girls in danger, that means you are out of here. Breaking contact.
The senator was astounded to learn that these games are being sold without any kind of content warnings or age recommendations. Movies had ratings. Television had content advisories. Even music was beginning to carry parental advisory labels. But video games, despite increasingly realistic and graphic content, were being sold to anyone with enough money to purchase them. By December 1st, 1993, Lieberman had seen enough. He called a press conference that would forever change the trajectory of the video game industry. Standing alongside other child advocates, including Bob Keeshan, better known to millions as Captain Kangaroo, Lieberman announced his intention to hold congressional hearings on video game violence. The press conference was a masterclass in political theater. Lieberman had prepared video clips showcasing the most shocking moments from Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, presenting them to an audience of reporters who were seeing this content for the first time. The contrast was stark and deliberate. On one side stood Captain Kangaroo, the gentle entertainer who dedicated his life to nurturing children's minds, and on the other were these graphic depictions of violence that seemed designed to corrupt those same young minds.
I don't believe what I just saw. Those bloodsuckers just got Lisa, and you had a chance to save her. I put the lives of those girls in your hands, and you screwed up. I'm pulling the plug on you before you do any more damage.
We're not talking about Pac-Man or Space Invaders anymore, Lieberman declared, his voice carrying the moral authority of a man who genuinely believed he's protecting children from harm. We're talking about video games that glorify violence and teach children to enjoy inflicting the most gruesome forms of cruelty imaginable. Lieberman's research had revealed what he considered to be damning statistics. The average video game player was between 7 and 12 years old, yet the industry was increasingly producing content that seemed designed for mature audiences. Mortal Kombat had already sold over 3 million copies and was projected to generate more than 100 million in revenue by the end of the year. To Lieberman, this represented corporate greed run amok, with companies willing to corrupt children's minds for profit. The video game industry's response was swift but fractured. Nintendo, which had censored Mortal Kombat by removing the blood and toning down the fatalities, tried to position itself as a responsible, family-friendly option. Howard Lincoln, Nintendo of America's chairman, would later use the congressional hearings to attack Sega's decision to include the violent content, essentially throwing their competitor under the bus in an attempt to save their own reputation. Sega, meanwhile, found itself in an impossible position. Their uncensored version of Mortal Kombat had outsold Nintendo's sanitized version by a ratio of 5-1, proving that consumers wanted the controversial content. But now, they're being portrayed as irresponsible merchants of violence, peddling corruption to children for profit. The first congressional hearing took place on December 9, 1993, before the combined Senate committees on governmental affairs and the judiciary. The atmosphere was tense, with industry representatives facing hostile questioning from senators who seemed to have already made up their minds about the dangers of video game violence. Senator Lieberman opened with a presentation that showcased the most graphic moments from Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, playing video clips that looked shocking when displayed on official government monitors in a formal congressional setting. The effect was deliberate and devastating. Content that might seem merely exciting in a teenager's bedroom appeared deeply disturbing when viewed in the sterile environment of a Senate hearing room. "I looked at the game too, and there was a classic," Lieberman said of Night Trap. "It ends with this attack scene on this woman in lingerie in her bedroom. I know that the creator of the game said it was all meant to be satire of Dracula, but nonetheless, I thought it sent out the wrong message." The industry representatives struggled to defend their products. Nintendo's Howard Lincoln, an experienced lawyer, proved the more capable advocate, repeatedly emphasizing his company's family-friendly policies while subtly attacking Sega's decision to include graphic content. "In the past year, some very violent and offensive games have reached the market," Lincoln testified, "and of course I'm speaking about Mortal Kombat and Night Trap." Sega's Bill White appeared far less prepared for the political theater. He stumbled through questions about his company's rating system, seemed uncertain about technical details, and at one point even misidentified a Nintendo product as a Sega device. The contrast with Lincoln's polished performance was stark and damaging. The senators were relentless in their questioning. Herbert Kohl, Lieberman's co-chair, warned the industry representatives that, "You don't do something about content ratings, we will." The threat was clear. The industry could regulate itself voluntarily, or Congress would step in and regulate it for them. The hearing revealed a fundamental disconnect between the gaming industry and the political establishment. Industry representatives spoke about artistic expression, technological innovation, and consumer choice. The senators focused on child protection, moral values, and corporate responsibility. It was a clash of worldviews that seemed destined for conflict. Perhaps most tellingly, the hearing demonstrated how little the politicians understood about the medium they were attempting to regulate. Senator Byron Dorgan appeared confused about basic game mechanics, while other senators seemed to think that all video games were necessarily marketed to children simply because the medium itself was associated with toys and entertainment. In the aftermath of the December hearing, the video game industry found itself facing an unprecedented crisis. The threat of federal regulation was real and immediate. Lieberman had already begun drafting legislation that would create a government-controlled ratings board if the industry didn't act quickly. The industry's response revealed the competitive tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Nintendo and Sega, despite being fierce rivals, were forced to work together to create a unified rating system. This collaboration was unprecedented and uncomfortable. The two companies had spent years attacking each other in advertising campaigns and competing for market dominance. Sega had actually been ahead of the curve on content ratings, having introduced their Video Game Rating Council, VRC, just before the release of home console Mortal Kombat. The VRC used a simple system of ratings from GA, general audiences, to MA-17, mature audiences. However, Nintendo representatives objected to adopting Sega's system, unwilling to appear as if they were following their competitor's lead. The solution was to create an entirely new, vendor-neutral organization, the Interactive Digital Software Association, the IDSA, which would later become the Entertainment Software Association. This trade group would oversee the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, a system modeled after the Motion Picture Association's film ratings, but adapted for the unique challenges of interactive entertainment. The industry worked with remarkable speed, driven by the very real threat of government intervention. The ESRB was announced just hours before the second congressional hearing in March 1994, a timeline so compressed that it seemed almost miraculous to outside observers. The new rating system used letter grades similar to film ratings: E for everyone, T for teen, M for mature, and AO for adults only. Each rating was accompanied by content descriptors that explained specifically why a game had received its rating: animated blood and gore, strong language, simulated gambling, and dozens of other categories that helped parents understand exactly what content their children would encounter. Perhaps most importantly, the ESRB established a code of ethics that governed how games could be marketed and advertised. M-rated games couldn't be advertised during children's television programming or in youth-oriented magazines. Store displays had to clearly show rating information. The industry was essentially agreeing to restrict its own marketing and sales practices in exchange for the freedom to create content without direct government oversight. Just as the industry thought it was getting the controversy under control, id Software released Doom in December 1993. If Mortal Kombat had shocked senators with its realistic human-on-human violence, Doom represented something entirely new and potentially more disturbing: first-person perspective violence with unprecedented graphic detail. Doom placed players directly in the shoes of a space marine fighting demons on Mars. Unlike Mortal Kombat's fighting game format or Night Trap's passive observation mechanics, Doom required players to actively seek out and destroy enemies using an arsenal of increasingly powerful weapons. The game's first-person perspective meant that players saw the violence through their own eyes, creating an unprecedented sense of immersion and agency. What made Doom particularly controversial was its distribution method. Rather than requiring expensive trips to software stores, Doom was distributed freely over the internet as shareware. The first episode was completely free, with players encouraged to copy and share it with friends. This viral distribution model meant that Doom spread through computer networks at an unprecedented rate, reaching millions of players without any traditional retail gatekeeping. The game was so popular and so widely distributed that it single-handedly demonstrated the potential of internet-based software distribution, predating the commercial internet by several years. For politicians already concerned about the video game violence, Doom represented a new and frightening escalation. Here was a game that was more violent than anything they'd previously seen, distributed through channels they didn't understand, reaching audiences they couldn't control. The game's popularity among computer-savvy young men, the same demographic that would later be associated with school violence, only intensified their concerns. Doom also introduced a new element to the controversy: modding. The game was designed to be modified by players who could create their own levels, weapons, and scenarios. This user-generated content was largely unregulated and uncontrolled, creating the possibility that players could create scenarios even more violent or disturbing than anything the original developers had imagined. The timing couldn't have been worse for the industry's attempts to demonstrate responsibility and self-regulation. Just as Nintendo and Sega were working to establish the ESRB and prove that they could police themselves, Doom seemed to prove that the medium was becoming more violent and more difficult to control, not less. The second congressional hearing, held on March 4, 1994, had a dramatically different tone from the December session. The industry arrived with a concrete proposal for self-regulation, having spent months developing the ESRB system in response to congressional pressure. The announcement of the ratings board took much of the wind out of the senators' sails. Lieberman, while still skeptical, acknowledged that the industry had made a good faith effort to address his concerns. The voluntary nature of the system appealed to lawmakers who were uncomfortable with direct government regulation of creative content, while the comprehensive nature of the ratings satisfied those who wanted strong protections for children. The bipartisan nature of the solution reflected the complex politics of the era. Senators from both parties had expressed concerns about video game content, but they also recognized the constitutional issues involved in government censorship of entertainment media. The industry's willingness to self-regulate provided a path that addressed parental concerns, without requiring Congress to navigate the thorny First Amendment questions that direct regulation would have raised. The industry representatives were better prepared this time, having learned from their mistakes in the December hearing. They emphasized their commitment to responsible marketing and their willingness to work with the parent groups and child advocates to ensure the rating system would be effective and trustworthy. Perhaps most importantly, the industry had learned to speak the language of child protection rather than artistic freedom. Instead of defending violent content as legitimate expression, they focused on their commitment to giving parents the information they needed to make informed decisions about their children's entertainment. The senators still had concerns, but the existence of a concrete, detailed proposal for industry self-regulation made it much harder to justify immediate government intervention. Lieberman announced that he would continue to monitor the situation and reserve the right to introduce legislation if the voluntary system proved inadequate. But for the moment, the immediate crisis had passed. The hearings concluded with what amounted to a gentleman's agreement. The industry would implement and enforce the ESRB rating system, and Congress would refrain from direct regulation as long as the voluntary system proved effective. It was a compromise that neither side loved, but both could live with. The Entertainment Software Rating Board officially launched in September 1994, just 9 months after the first congressional hearing. The speed of implementation was remarkable, but it came at a cost. The system was necessarily rushed, and many of its procedures and policies would evolve significantly over the following years. The early ESRB faced immediate challenges. How do you rate interactive content that changes based on player choices? How do you handle games with user-generated content? What about online multiplayer games where player behavior can't be controlled or predicted? These were entirely new questions that had no precedent in film or television ratings. The board established a review process where publishers would submit detailed questionnaires describing their game's content, along with video footage showing the most extreme examples of violence, language, and sexual content. A panel of trained raters, typically parents, educators, and child development experts with no ties to the gaming industry, would review this material and assign appropriate ratings and content descriptors. The system worked better than many critics expected. Retailers quickly adopted policies requiring age verification for M-rated games, and parents began paying attention to ratings when making purchasing decisions. The dire predictions of government censorship or industry collapse proved unfounded. If anything, the existence of clear ratings seemed to give developers more freedom to create mature content, since parents could now make informed decisions about what was appropriate for their children. However, the ESRB's early years were not without controversy. Critics argued that the board was too lenient, allowing excessively violent games to receive M ratings when they deserved the commercial death sentence of an AO rating. Others complained that the ratings were inconsistent, with similar content receiving different ratings depending on the context or the presentation. The board also struggled with the rapid pace of technological change. As games became more sophisticated and realistic, violence that had seemed shocking in 1993 began to appear relatively tame. The standards that had been established for 16-bit console games proved inadequate for the 3D graphics and surround sound of the next-generation systems. For more than a decade, the ESRB system worked relatively smoothly. There were occasional controversies and complaints, but nothing that threatened the fundamental compact between the industry and Congress. Then, in 2005, everything changed with the discovery of the hot coffee modification for Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. The controversy began when modder Patrick Wildenborg discovered that San Andreas contained fully rendered sexual content that had been programmed into the game but had been made inaccessible to players through normal gameplay. By modifying a few lines of code, players could unlock a crude but explicit sexual minigame that had never been disclosed to the ESRB during the rating process. Rockstar Games initially claimed that the content had been created entirely by modders and was not part of the original game. This defense quickly collapsed when hackers discovered that the sexual content could be unlocked on unmodified PlayStation 2 and Xbox versions using simple cheat codes, proving that the content had been included on the retail discs. The political response was swift and severe. Senator Hillary Clinton called for Federal Trade Commission investigations, while Congressman Fred Upton introduced a House resolution demanding to know whether Rockstar had intentionally deceived the ESRB. The resolution passed by an overwhelming margin of 355 to 21, demonstrating bipartisan outrage over the perceived deception. For the ESRB, hot coffee represented an existential crisis. The entire foundation of the rating system was based on trust. Publishers were expected to honestly disclose all content in their games, and the board assigned ratings based on that disclosure. If publishers could hide content and reveal it later through modifications, the entire system would become meaningless. The board's response was dramatic and unprecedented. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was stripped of its M rating and re-rated AO, becoming the first major commercial game to receive the industry's most restrictive rating. Rockstar was forced to halt production of all versions of the game and release a clean version with the hidden content completely removed before the M rating could be restored. More importantly, the ESRB fundamentally changed its policies in response to hot coffee. Publishers were now required to disclose not just playable content, but any content that existed in the game's code, even if it was locked away and inaccessible through normal gameplay. The board also increased its maximum fine for non-disclosure to $1 million, demonstrating its commitment to enforcing the new standards. The aftermath of hot coffee saw the implementation of the most sweeping changes to the ESRB system since its creation. The new disclosure requirements meant that publishers had to be much more careful about what content they included in their games, even in preliminary or unused form. Development practices across the industry began to change. studios implemented new procedures to ensure that unused or experimental content was completely removed from final builds rather than simply disabled. Quality assurance teams were trained to look for hidden content that might create ratings issues. Legal departments became more involved in the development process, reviewing games for potential compliance problems. The modding community also felt the impact of the hot coffee controversy. While the ESRB acknowledged that mods could add value to games and extend their lifespan, the board also expressed concern that modifications could undermine the accuracy of ratings. Some publishers began implementing technical measures to make their games more difficult to modify, particularly in ways that might reveal hidden content or change the game's rating-relevant material. Patricia Vance, the ESRB's president, noted the broader implications of the new policies. The integrity of the ESRB rating system rests upon its accuracy and reliability, and we will continue to do whatever is necessary to protect the public's trust in it. The changes extended beyond technical requirements to cultural shifts within the industry. The era of pushing boundaries through hidden or barely accessible content was largely over. Developers who wanted to include their mature themes and graphic content now had to be completely transparent about their intentions and accept the ratings consequences of their creative decisions. Perhaps most significantly, the hot coffee controversy demonstrated that the games industry had become important enough to attract serious political attention. The days when video games could be dismissed as toys for children were clearly over. This is now a multi-billion-dollar entertainment medium that could influence elections and reshape political careers. Today, more than 30 years after Senator Lieberman first stood up in that congressional hearing room, the ESRB continues to rate virtually every video game sold in North America. The system has evolved far beyond its origins, expanding to cover mobile apps, digital downloads, and online content that the senators of 1993 could never have imagined. The industry that emerged from those contentious hearings is fundamentally different from the one that entered them. Content ratings are now as much a part of game development as art assets or sound design. Publishers routinely factor rating considerations into their creative decisions, and retailers have sophisticated systems for enforcing age restrictions that would have seemed impossible in 1993. The political landscape has also changed dramatically. Video games are no longer seen as primarily children's entertainment. The average gamer is now over 30 years old, and politicians are more likely to court the gaming vote than to condemn the medium. The Supreme Court's 2011 decision in Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association explicitly recognized video games as protected speech under the First Amendment, finally settling the constitutional questions that had lurked beneath the surface of the original congressional hearings. Yet the fundamental tensions that sparked the original controversy remain unsolved. Each new generation of gaming technology brings new questions about the medium's potential impact on players. Virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and increasingly realistic graphics continue to push boundaries in ways that would have been unimaginable to the senators who first grappled with digitized martial arts fighters and full-motion video vampires. The rating system itself has become more sophisticated and comprehensive, but also more complex and sometimes more controversial. The rise of online gaming, user-generated content, and live service games has created new challenges that require constant adaptation and evolution of rating policies. Behind the political maneuvering and industry evolution, it's worth remembering the human cost of these changes. The congressional hearings and their aftermath ended careers, damaged reputations, and fundamentally altered the creative process for thousands of game developers. Night Trap, the game that became a symbol of everything wrong with the medium, was pulled from store shelves and became a cautionary tale rather than the campy horror homage its creators had intended. The game's developers found themselves portrayed as merchants of misogyny. Their attempts to create interactive entertainment transformed into evidence of moral corruption. Mortal Kombat, meanwhile, spawned an entire franchise and became one of the most successful fighting game series of all time. The controversy that nearly destroyed it ultimately made it famous, proving that in the entertainment industry, even negative attention can translate to commercial success. The careers of the politicians involved followed different trajectories. Joe Lieberman parlayed his reputation as a defender of family values into a vice presidential nomination in 2000, though he would later become a controversial figure for his support of the Iraq War and his opposition to key Democratic priorities. His legacy in gaming remains complex, reviled by many players as a would-be censorer, but respected by others as someone who forced the industry to take responsibility for its content. For the developers, artists, and programmers who actually created these games, the hearings represented a fundamental shift in how they approach their work. The era of creating content first and worrying about consequences later was over. Every design decision now had to be filtered through questions of rating impact and potential controversy. As we look back on the events of 1993 and 1994, it's clear that the creation of the ESRB resolved some issues while creating others. The rating system successfully prevented direct government censorship and gave parents tools to make informed decisions about their children's entertainment. But it also created new forms of industry self-censorship and established precedents for content regulation that continue to evolve today. The fundamental question that drove the original controversy, whether violent media content can influence real-world behavior, remains hotly debated despite decades of research. The scientific consensus suggests that any effects are complex and highly dependent on individual factors, but politicians and activists continue to cite video games as contributing factors in various social problems. Perhaps more importantly, the hearings established patterns of political response to new media technologies that continue to play out today. From social media to artificial intelligence, new technologies that capture public attention inevitably face calls for regulation and oversight, often driven by moral panics that echo the concerns raised about video games in the 90s. The ESRB system itself continues to evolve, adapting to new technologies and changing social standards. The board now rates mobile apps, virtual reality experiences, and online games that blur the traditional boundaries between entertainment and social interaction. Each new technological development brings new challenges that require creative solutions and policy adaptations. The story of the congressional hearings and the creation of the ESRB is ultimately a story about how a new medium of expression fought for and won its right to exist as adult entertainment. Like comic books, rock music, and movies before them, video games faced a moral panic that threatened their existence as a commercial art form. The industry's response, creating a comprehensive self-regulatory system while maintaining creative freedom, represented a masterful political compromise that has largely stood the test of time. The ESRB has never been perfect, and it's faced constant criticism from various quarters, but it has successfully prevented the government censorship that once seemed inevitable. Today's gaming landscape, with its billion-dollar budgets, international audiences, and cultural influence, would have been unimaginable to the senators who first watched grainy footage of Mortal Kombat fatalities in that hearing room. The medium that they saw as a threat to children has become a dominant form of entertainment consumed by people of all ages around the world. The technical achievements that once seemed so shocking, realistic human characters, graphic violence, interactive narratives are now taken for granted. Modern games routinely feature content that would have horrified the politicians of 1993. Yet this content exists within a regulatory framework that provides parents with detailed information about what their children are experiencing. The three games that started it all have very different legacies. Mortal Kombat became a franchise worth billions of dollars, with new entries continuing to push boundaries while working with the rating system. Night Trap found new life as a cult classic, eventually being re-released to nostalgic audiences who appreciate its campy charm. Doom spawned an entire genre of first-person shooters and established id Software as one of the most influential developers in gaming history. Perhaps most significantly, these games proved that interactive entertainment could be powerful enough to capture the attention of the most powerful people in the country. They demonstrated that video games are not just toys or time wasters, but a new form of media with the potential to influence culture, shape opinions, and change lives. In the end, the congressional hearings of 1993 and 1994 may be remembered not as an attack on video games, but as their graduation ceremony, the moment when the medium proved it was important enough to demand serious attention and sophisticated regulation. The senators who sought to protect children from digital violence inadvertently helped create the system that allowed video games to become the dominant entertainment medium of the 21st century. The ratings board they forced into existence didn't diminish the power of interactive entertainment. It legitimized it, giving the medium the cultural credibility and regulatory framework it needed to reach its full potential. From the ashes of moral panic and political controversy emerged an art form that now rivals movies and television in its cultural impact and commercial importance. And it all started with a father who just wanted to buy his son a video game for Christmas. Thanks for listening.